Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon. It is a privilege for me to introduce our speaker for today, who carries with him over 5 years of experience in the domains of gender and sexuality research and advocacy, with specific focus on LGBTQIA communities, mental health and sexual health advocacy, development communications, and strategic human resources management. Kanav has worked for NGOs, not for profits, and for profits engaged in international development, monitoring and evaluation, environmental and social consulting, student leadership development, anti human trafficking, and LGBTQIA advocacy. His work has appeared in the Diplomat magazine, Cosmopolitan India, Jurist, and Oranam, among others. His debut semi-autobiographical essay was published by Savidhi Publication House in 2020 in a literary fiction anthology called Life, A Cocktail of Emotions. He is also a regular guest speaker for international digital media platforms such as Report Out's Hidden Voices podcast, the Worldly Wellbeing podcast, and the Riot Roti podcast. Kanav is passionate about volunteering and currently sits on the leadership team of Harmless Hugs, a Delhi-based LGBTQIA+ support group, and Queer Academia, an initiative by Men Life Foundation. He is also a QPR certified gatekeeper for suicide awareness and prevention. We look forward to your lecture, sir. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanvi, and thank you so much, Professor, for that warm welcome and that warm introduction. I just want to clarify if I'm audible to you and everybody else.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really, really happy to talk to all of you today about today's topic. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and sharing my presentation, and we'll get started with this discussion. So, let me just start presenting. Please let me know if my screen is visible to all of you.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, good evening, all of you, and welcome to today's discussion on alternative sexualities in contemporary India. I think it's really great that the Equal Opportunity Cell at your university is organizing something like this, and I'm sure that this conversation will probably inspire a lot of you to think a little bit differently about alternative sexualities and also understand the way in which the law intersects with them. And the perspectives that you will develop with the other speakers will also add to that richness. So basically, I've already been introduced, but I think I just want to highlight that I do not have a legal background myself, although I am working at a legal think tank. I have varied experience in communications, in HR. I worked in the corporate sector and development sector.
Kanav, we are unable to hear you. Sorry. Could you please unmute yourself, Kanav?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that happened. Am I audible?
Yes, now you are audible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So as I was saying, that even though I don't have a background in law, one of the reasons I chose to work at the legal think tank was because I found that the law has something very interesting to say about people who are from the LGBTQI plus community. And I think that is another conversation that we are going to have throughout the course of this lecture. So, how I've structured this discussion of alternative sexualities in contemporary India is as follows. I think the first thing that we need to talk about in this discussion is what constitutes an alternative sexuality. And I draw primarily from queer theory. It's very interesting that Indian law has not yet applied queer theory when it has adjudicated cases that relate to the rights of sexual minorities and gender minorities. And also for people who happen to be from other disciplines, I think there's a lot that can be learned from queer theory. Of course, queer theory itself is another discipline that requires a lot of time, so we will not be going into the details of queer theory. but I will just introduce all of you to it, and I think that's a space where we can have more conversation. After we talk about alternative sexualities, we'll quickly talk about how law intersects with queerness. We will also talk about the digital world, the world that all of us are currently inhabiting, and how that impacts the lives of queer people, especially those with alternative sexualities in modern India. And finally, if there will not be much time, but very briefly, I will talk about some other institutions, social institutions that have dealt with the question of how do we give people with alternative sexualities a space in modern India. If there is time, I would like to also talk to you about an independent study that I did at my university on alternative sexualities. It was a very fascinating study about marriage and how people with alternative sexualities had to have that very difficult conversation with their families that they did not wish to marry somebody of the opposite sex. And this is an issue that quite a lot of us in India would have to face at some point in our lives with our parents. So it's very fascinating what I discovered, but that is again something we'll discuss if there is time. Um, so I would like to, introduce all of you to this very interesting book that was written by Professor Madhavi Menon. She wrote this book in December 2021, so it's a very, very new book. It's called The Law of Desire, and Madhavi Menon is also not a lawyer. She's actually an English professor at Ashoka University who has been writing a lot about queer theory and desire for almost a decade. And it's a fascinating book, very small but very insightful account of basically how Indian law understands and treats this one word, and that word is desire. Desire is something that you aspire for. It is something that you wish to claim as part of your own. It is a form of an aspiration that a lot of us have towards objects and people. And very interestingly, this is excerpt from her book, which she says that the way in which the public discourse around desire and the way in which the law in our country understands desire hinges on four adjectives. Those four adjectives are criminal, immoral, obscene, and unnatural. Am I audible?
Y- Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, it's very fascinating that she uses these four adjectives, because if you look at the Suresh Kaushal and versus Nas Foundation judgment in 2013, you find this kind of language being used. So, for those of you who are not familiar, in India, the legal battle regarding homosexuality has been fraught with a lot of challenges. In 2009, the Delhi High Court had basically made a very, very important judgment where they stated that homosexuality was not a crime, and that Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which basically criminalized homosexuality, the Delhi High Court said that that was invalid. In 2013, the Supreme Court of India basically said that what the Delhi High Court had argued was wrong. And this is an excerpt of that judgment. It's called Suresh Kumar Kaushal versus Nas Foundation. Suresh Kumar Kaushal was a very orthodox conservative man who felt that homosexuals were a sin and they were destroying Indian society. And Nas Foundation is an NGO that has been working on HIV/AIDS awareness. So this is the judgment that came out. This is the language of the Supreme Court at that time, where if you can read this excerpt, you can see that they say that that protecting the so-called rights of LGBT people is not something that is valid. It's not something that the Supreme Court of India recognizes as valid, and that also you can see in the fourth line. The High Court has extensively relied upon judgments of other jurisdictions, which basically means that the Delhi High Court was basically drawing from judgments in America, in the UK, in Canada. These are countries where you have very progressive laws on LGBTQ rights. And so the Supreme Court of India in 2013 basically said that we are a country that has its own culture, its own morals, its own values, and you cannot import Western ideas and values into our country, right? This is what the Supreme Court said in 2013. In 2018, the Supreme Court reversed this decision. We will talk about that later. Why am I mentioning this here is if you look at what Madhavi Menon says, how does the law look at desire? As criminal, immoral, obscene, and unnatural. In IPC 377, the word unnatural is used. And the fact that the Supreme Court had recriminalized homosexuality shows that there was a point in time where the Supreme Court viewed the desire of homosexuals as criminal, as something that was immoral, not in tune with Indian society, the way in which Indian society functions. So, this is how the law understands alternative sexualities, specifically homosexuals. And here I want to talk to you about a very interesting concept that comes to us from queer theory, which is the idea of normativity. Those of you, I believe some of you actually have a are pursuing your PhD as well. I'm sure some of you who are in the gender studies field would be aware of what the idea of normativity means. You may have also heard these words cis normative and heteronormative being thrown around in the internet. Maybe just to make it very brief, very simple, all I will say is the word normativity comes from the word norm. Norm is that which is considered to be acceptable or normal, right? And so in our society, people who have sexual attractions towards people of the opposite sex are said to be normal. You've heard this phrase being thrown around, right? This is abnormal, this is unnatural, and this is normal. And so queer theory basically tells us, allows us to challenge this idea of what is considered normal by most people in society, the majority in society. So Nikki Sullivan is basically a Western scholar. She is a professor of media studies in Australia and in the UK, and she basically writes this very interesting paragraph about what the word queer means. I hope I'm not lost or some of you already, but I think the next slide will make things easy. Just take a few minutes to read this short paragraph where she talks about the word queer. It's very accessible. Just going to pause for a few seconds so that you read it, and then we will continue. So as you can see, she doesn't really answer what do you mean by the word queer and what do you mean by queer theory. She's basically saying that the word queer has been used in many ways. And it has been used to denote something that's strange. You may have the word queer actually means something that is weird. It was also a pejorative, pejorative word used against homosexuals in the 1960s and 70s in the US, and in the global north rather. And it has also been reclaimed by queer activists to denote their identity. So when we talk about alternative sexualities, I think this is the best way to explain it to you. Think of queer as an umbrella, and just as an umbrella has different pieces of cloth, right? Gender and sexual minorities form a part of that cloth. And so the purpose of this part of this discussion was to explain to you what is an alternative sexuality, right? So just like an umbrella encompasses everything, the different parts of that umbrella include different identities. Those identities are gender and sexual identities. So alternative sexuality is just a part of that umbrella. The entire umbrella is queer. It is the word queer. This is one way of understanding who alternative sexualities, what constitutes alternative sexualities. So that is something I just wanted to give you this broad understanding. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about queer theory was to tell you that there is a theory that has been for a long time a theory help built around this idea of what it means to be queer. Um, those of you who are very interested in this topic even more can probably consider reading and researching about gender studies and gender theory. It's far more complicated than what I've presented, but I've just tried to present a very broad and simplistic concept in front of you. um, you will hear these words LGBT plus. They all are very similar. Basically, the each acronym means something. So L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender. Plus basically means that there are other identities in that entire rainbow, that entire patch that makes the rainbow. So the letter A means asexual, I means intersex. So it's like a very long acronym. Because some people don't want to go into this long acronym, do not want to are not able to remember this long acronym. There's another word called SOGI, SOGI. You can see the Council of Europe has mentioned this on their website where they use the word SOGI. You can see on top, right next to Council of Europe, it says sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's basically another way of saying that all these acronyms can be combined under this term SOGI. So some people prefer the word queer, some people prefer the word soji, some people prefer the word LGBTQ, LGBT plus. But broadly, Q or queer is the umbrella term that people typically use. But I do want to remind everyone that it has historically been a pejorative. It is not something that has been historically used as a very, very optimistic or a very positive word. And this makes us wonder that when we talk about alternative sexualities, we're talking about a group of people whose sexuality is different. It's alternative, which means it is not mainstream. Going back to the word that I introduced you to a while ago, it is not normative. That which is normal, it is not normal. This is something that I want you to think about. That why is it that when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, that we always try to compare it with something that is not normal? Is there something not normal about being gay? Is there something not normal about being lesbian? This is a question that people have asked over many years, and you will have conversations with mental health experts who will tell you that very recently the Indian Psychiatric Association had basically released a statement where they said that sexual orientation is natural and normal. And the new Supreme Court judgment, by the new Indian Supreme Court judgment that came out in 2018, basically states the same thing. So to say that if you happen to have an alternative sexuality, that it is not normal is wrong. But definitely it is alternative because it is not the mainstream. It is not what the media talks about. It is not what your family will expect hearing and understanding, because their understanding of sexuality is very different. That is why it's called alternative. What queer theory, which I introduce you, does really well is not just explain the diversity that exists around us, it also allows us to see the world differently. Epistemology and ontology are terms in philosophy. I am not sure if I would should go into those details in this conversation, but all I will say is this: that in addition to helping us understand sexual orientation and gender identity as an umbrella, what queer theory also does is it allows you to see the world differently. It allows you to see the world through the eyes of somebody who is considered, has been told from for many years that they are not normal. And I think the easiest way to explain it to you would be by looking at the picture on the left hand side. It shows a set of anti-LGBTQ protesters in the United Kingdom. In 2019, what basically happened was many schools in the UK wanted to introduce sex education in their curriculum, and they wanted to include a topic about gender identity and sexual orientation, and they wanted to teach this to young children. So what happened was quite a few parents did not like this decision, and so you can see them standing here with these posters, and you can read what they've written. It says, "Let children be children. Stop brainwashing our children." Right. So this is what the protesters are saying. So why am I talking to you about this? Is because I just told you that queer theory is a way for you to view the world and see the world differently through the eyes of the protesters. They think that by teaching children about sexual orientation, you're brainwashing them. You're telling them that they are learning something that's corrupt, perverse, because it has to do with sex and sexuality. So, from the eyes of the parents, they think that they're protecting the rights of their children, and they're protecting the innocence of their children by not allowing such education being to be taught in schools. But if you think of it from the perspective of somebody who's gay or lesbian, this seems to be ridiculous, because a person who's gay or lesbian or bisexual or whatever from a very, very young age knows that they're different. So to teach children that there is such a thing as LGBTQI plus or whatever would actually make their life easier, because they will now understand that they are not alone and they're not different. So are you seeing that there are two different ways of viewing the same thing, which is sex education? And queer theory basically allows you to see the world through the eyes of a queer person. And so this applies to everything, not just education, but even something like healthcare. Right? For a very long time, people thought that homosexuality was a mental disorder. So a doctor would conduct shock treatment, or what they would call shock treatment, to cure. I'm using the word cure in quotation marks. Cure somebody who was homosexual. But to a homosexual person, not all, but some homosexual people will say that there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just attracted to somebody of the same sex. Why do you need to electrocute me why do you need why would you need to electrocute me to change me when I don't want to be changed? And so these are two different ways of seeing the world. Of course, there's a big debate in many parts of the world, even today, including in India. There are many people who still believe that homosexuality is a problem, being trans is a problem, LGBTQ is some sort of a liberal ideology that is not at all acceptable to us. There are all sorts of arguments and ideologies out there. Queer theory is one way of understanding the world and looking and listening to queer people themselves and drawing from their experience. It's a I think for those of you who are interested in queer in law, especially since some of you are practicing LLB, it might be nice to see queer theory and how it relates to the law. And that brings me to, I think, the next part of my discussion. I'm not gonna I don't think it'll be fair to go into the details of everything, but just to give you a broad picture, what I wanted to show you is that it has taken us a very long time in India to really bring about change in the legal system. So you can see in 1991, almost 30 more than 30 years ago, the economic reforms happened. The economic reforms were the LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms happened. And that was also the time when India saw its first lesbian collective called Sakhi come up. But at that time, Indian society was very orthodox. And at that time, conversations about homosexuality and LGBT rights were practically unheard of. And you compare that to 2018, now I'm moving from left to right. You see that the Supreme Court of India decriminalizes homosexuality. So it took the Supreme Court almost 26 to 27 years to decriminalize homosexuality. Why have I mentioned 24 years at the bottom? Is because the first petition to challenge Section 377 was filed in 1994 by by an AIDS advocacy group. So it took the courts 24 years to make this decision, which was to decriminalize homosexuality. And in between, there were other few important judgments. The Puthaswamy judgment in 2017 is also called the privacy judgment, which very famously stated that a person's sexual orientation is a part of is their private matter. The courts cannot interfere with a person's private matters, and that includes their sexual orientation, which means that your landlord cannot ask you whether you're gay or straight. Your police officer cannot ask you, why is it that you're roaming around with that woman or that man? Are you gay or straight? Or why is it that you're applying makeup? Are you a transgender or not? That is not a question that the police can ask you, because it is your privacy includes your sexual orientation. This judgment came 1 year prior to the Naftage judgment. The Nalsa judgment is very important. It is a judgment on transgender rights. It recognized the third gender. Um, so if you look at it, the law has been progressively changing, but it has taken us a while. And you look at the recent developments as we stand now in 2022, we have already started talking about same-sex marriage. Those two women you see in the picture, they are petitioners who are trying to legalize same-sex. They want their own marriage to be legalized. They're a lesbian couple in New Delhi. And simultaneously to this, you will see that there's a discussion in our country for a uniform civil code, which will basically remove all our personal laws. And it's very fascinating because if you read our MP, our members of parliament talk about a uniform civil code, they don't talk about the rights of LGBT people. They just say that we want a uniform civil code that eliminates all our personal laws, but they don't say whether this uniform civil code will include LGBTQ marriages or LGBTQ couples. So that is something that even our politicians are not discussing very often. Speaking of which, you have on the left-hand side Madhya Pradesh politician Narottam Mishra. Some of you may be familiar with him because he came out against an advertisement on by that Dabur had put out, which featured two lesbian women. It was a very interesting advertisement. You can Google it, Dabur advertisement on lesbian Karwa Chauth. It's very interesting, and he said that it was against our Indian culture. Going back to the first discussion we had about how some of our politicians and lawmakers believe that homosexuality is against our culture. And Judge Anand Venkatesh is a South Indian judge who basically had made a very progressive judgment in the High Court, where he said that there needs to be greater education about LGBTQ rights. So these are, you see, very a lot of contrasts also. You have some judges and politicians like Dr. Shashi Tharoor who support gay rights, and then you have some politicians like Mr. Narottam Mishra and others who do not. And the opposition is very clear. A vast majority will be quiet. That's why when you have conversations about the Uniform Civil Code, you do not really hear conversations about LGBTQ rights or alternative sexualities. You do not hear these words also uttered in Parliament. Before I move on, I just want to pause, if that's okay, in case anybody has anything to ask. because I understand I've been speaking for a while, and I don't want people to have questions that they would want cleared immediately.
Yeah, you can take a pause.
Yeah. So I'm not able to see the chat box if people are posting questions there. Professor, should I answer them
Yeah,
now?
sure. Yeah. We just drop the message, and otherwise, also, if you have any questions so far, what all Kanav has talked about, you can please post your questions in the chat box, or else you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Okay, I'm presuming there are no questions.
So
Should I?
far,
Okay, so
we
then
will take some time to, yeah,
yeah, okay. So then I'll continue.
please.
Um, So, if you remember, right at the beginning of the lecture, I had said that there would be three dimensions that I would like to talk about in relation to alternative sexualities, right? The first was the law, which we just discussed. The second would be the digital realm, and the third would be other institutions. So, talked about the law. We talked about how the law has historically excluded LGBTQI people and how it has taken us a long time to expand or even understand LGBTQ rights. Why I want to talk about the digital realm is because, again, I noticed that very few conversations around LGBTQ issues fails to account for the fact that we are now living in a very different world. We are living in a world where we are seeing artificial intelligence become the future. We see that conversations on artificial intelligence have started. We are living in a world increasingly dictated by the rules and norms of big tech companies and social media. And what the COVID pandemic has taught us is that moving into online spaces is slowly becoming the norm. Although we are now going back to this what we call the new normal, which is some sort of a hybrid model of world of work where you work and study on campus for maybe a few weeks or days, but you also spend some time online. And this is very interesting exercise and a very interesting experience of how our world is now changing from almost exclusively physical world to a world where your online presence, the online space has now been dominating us for the past 2 years. Yeah, 2 years. So the digital realm is important because, once again, when we talk about alternative sexualities in contemporary India, we very rarely talk about how their presence in the online world has changed over the years, and also what impact the online space has on somebody who has an alternative sexuality. Most books, most articles that you read about alternative sexualities will talk about the law, will talk about how we've lived in a country where homosexuality was criminalized. We'll talk about pride parades, we'll talk about the doctors, we'll talk about the lawyers, the mental health professionals. But we surprisingly haven't really heard much conversation about what it means to be queer on the internet. And this is why I wanted to talk to all of you about the digital realm. And I think, again, for those people who are interested, who are lawyers or aspiring lawyers in this class, it will be very nice and interesting to see your perspective on how you think the law can be shaped, keeping in mind that we are living in an online world. So Rohit Dasgupta is a academic. He's an Indian academic. He's actually Indian Bengali, but he is now a politician in the UK, and he's been writing a lot about queer theory. And his book is fascinating. It's quite a thick read, but what I wanted to talk to you about were just a few very interesting points that he raised. And I think these points make this issue of queerness more complicated rather than make it easy. And the reason I say that is because living in an online world is very complicated as it is. Many of you would know that since you're attending a certificate course online. And I don't know how many of you prefer online mode of education versus a physical mode of education. But you see a lot of similar questions being asked by queer theorists about being queer. Is it easier to be a queer person on the internet, or is it easier to be a queer person in a face-to-face setting where you interact with people and talk to people in maybe conference hall or in a classroom? um, why I ask this question is, if you look at point number 3, the irony of social networks, you see that the internet has this very interesting, has a very interesting dimension where it's like a coin, right? On one hand, you have anonymity. So you can choose to make a profile with any name you want. You can go on Facebook and make a fake profile, and you can just do whatever you want. And simultaneously, even though you're anonymous, you can still face hate. And you can some of you would know about what cyberbullying is and how that impacts our mental health. So for people who happen to be from a marginalized community or an alternative community, the internet allows you to basically explore yourself a little bit more, because you don't have to disclose your name. Your Aadhaar card is not linked to your Facebook account. You don't have to tell anybody that, hey, I'm gay, I need to access this meeting, or I want to understand what conversations this support group is having on LGBT rights. You don't need to disclose anything. A fake profile is all you need. But just as liberating as it might be to have a fake profile, it is also extremely worrying, because you could be the victim of a hate crime, you could be the victim of cyberbullying and phishing, and that can also happen by somebody anonymous. So the internet is a very unregulated space, although you now have laws that are trying to regulate the internet as well. And what the internet has also shown us is that you can have a sense of community and also a sense of loneliness, right? You must have heard, a lot of you would have heard that research that shows that younger people are now talking more openly about mental health, and the internet seems to exacerbate that, because you're connected to everyone and yet you feel alone, and you feel like those connections are not meaningful. And so what that does for queer people is also complicate their lives a little bit more, because now you're connected to all these other people from the all over the world who are queer, and yet you don't feel connected to somebody who you can really feel that you have shared a bond with. This is actually something that my researchers in my research study told me, in case you may be wondering why I'm mentioning all of this. And that actually brings me to my first point, which is that being queer has now become a transnational identity. Transnational basically means you're cutting across national borders. Because what happens is that on the internet, there is no sense or concept of national boundaries. You can be connected to somebody from Canada, to somebody from America, to somebody from Afghanistan or Pakistan, or any country in the world. You have Facebook groups where you have Indians who are in groups with Canadians, Americans, Pakistanis, South Asians, etc. But the laws that govern LGBT rights are very nationalized. India has an LGBT law. Pakistan has its LGBT law, UK has its LGBT law. So, as a queer person, you're a part of your own country, you're a citizen of your own country, but on the internet, you're a global citizen. And that is the interesting thing about the internet. And your understanding about yourself is governed by the laws and the norms of your country, as well as the norms and the law, not the laws, but the norms of this this very global transnational world that you occupy. And that sometimes makes it hard to understand what my identity is. That is what I mentioned in point number 5, the complication of your sexual identity, because people are confused. I am a part of an LGBT support group, Harmless Hugs, where a lot of people keep asking me this question that, I don't even know if I'm gay or straight. I don't know who I'm attracted to, or what, how to identify myself. And I've seen people who post these questions on our support group, and it becomes very hard for me as the moderator to answer their questions, because even I don't have those answers, because it's so complicated. As I said, it's queerness is an umbrella, and you have different parts of that umbrella that make it a whole. And the internet allows you to ask questions, it allows you to be anonymous when you ask those questions, but you may not necessarily get the answers that you like. And that is the very troubling part of the internet. What is also very troubling is the role of for-profit companies such as Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, that seem to have piggybacked off the entire LGBTQ movement. Let's not forget that the platform that we are currently on, Google Meets, is a part of a large multinational corporation called Google, which operates for profit, right? Similarly, Facebook is a part of a is a multinational corporation which also functions for profit, which has, and some of you might be knowing, come under attack by various politicians in India as well as in the US for meddling with US elections. And of course, there is a lot of hate speech and a lot of fake news that is also prevalent on these online platforms. So so when we talk about the digital realm, it's not happening somewhere out there. It's happening in a platform. those platforms are for profit tech companies. And so the choice for tech companies to censor LGBT people or not censor LGBT people lies with them. It's a very, very powerful, it's a very powerful role to have. Imagine being Mark Zuckerberg or somebody of that level, and you see people making Facebook groups on LGBT rights or on lesbian rights or transgender rights. You have the power to block all those groups from existing, or you have the power to block people who are against such groups. So it's a lot of power in the hands of a few people who control these tech companies. What we have noticed is that most tech companies tend to be pro LGBT. You see that most of these companies like Facebook and Google will say things like we are very pro diversity and inclusion and we support women's rights and LGBT rights. But a lot of there's been a lot of research that shows that a lot of what they say is very fake. There's a word called tokenism. Tokenism means that they are just saying this uh, to cash in on what's called woke culture. They just want to pretend to be progressive, but in reality, they're not. And why do I say this? Because if you look at the senior leadership of these tech companies, you'll see that there's very little representation of LGBTQ people in senior leadership. You'll see that for many, many years, these companies did not come in support of LGBTQ rights because it was so controversial. The people who have been fighting for LGBTQ rights were not these big tech companies and these big industrialists. It was always grassroots activists, people who risked their lives, their reputation to basically advocate for a more progressive law on homosexuality, on transgender rights, on lesbian rights. These companies have now come in much later when they see that the feminist movement and the LGBTQ movement, all of these movements are now coming together. These tech companies also see that okay, we should not be on the wrong side of history, so let us side with these LGBT people, which is why some academics have said that this has led to the rise of something called homo capitalism. The word capitalism and homosexual, it's basically a form of capitalism in which homosexual and queer identities are put on the forefront. And this has been critiqued by quite a few academics because they feel that it's a very fake way of advocating for LGBT rights. So you may see, for example, on Pride Month, you'll see some companies say things like, "Oh, this is Pride Month, get 25% off on your next booking," or if you're flying by Indigo or whichever company on this month, 1 month Pride Month, if you want, you can get some sort of discount or something. You'll see some companies come out with very fancy merchandise on Pride Month, and it has been criticized by academics. As soon as the Pride Month ends, uh, all of this will stop. And Pride Month, in case some of you didn't know, is typically in July. And I personally have noticed that it's only in that 1 month when companies talk about it, and then once the month ends, they just forget about all of this and they move on to something else. So for many companies, it's just a marketing gimmick. But that being said, having companies support LGBTQ rights is also, some will say, is also positive because something is better than nothing. And so that is the other side of the other side of the argument. And that's why I said the internet is like a coin, right? Just as you have anonymity, you have hate, you have community, you have loneliness, you have maybe tokenism, but then you have recognition also, right? When Mark Zuckerberg puts a picture on Facebook with rainbow colored filters, he is basically making a very powerful statement. He may be somebody who is guilty of committing a lot of crimes and being the CEO of a very corrupt organization, but he's also a very powerful person, and people listen to him. And so, what side of the argument you are on is something I leave to you. But I think again, when you're drafting, if you as lawyers or some of you, I think, have a background in mental health, if some of you wish to explore more, like, understand this interface of sexuality and the internet, it would be good to think about how capitalism has basically become a part and parcel of our lives and how the internet, in conjunction with capitalism, intersects with queer identities. It's something to think about. You also see the rise of dating apps. And again, with dating apps like Grindr, Tinder, Hinge, you have Facebook groups. Even I'm sure you can, even on LinkedIn, I believe people actually message each other for dates. These dating apps have two sides to it, right? On the one hand, you have a lot of body shaming and a lot of emphasis, unnecessary emphasis on physical beauty and physical appearance. But on the other hand, it opens you to a whole new set of people to meet. And for a lot of LGBT people, the internet, through these dating apps, allows them to meet new people. And so that is again a very, very interesting perspective. So the digital realm, as you can see, is this space that is filled with contradictions. It is filled with complications, but it is also a place of opportunity. Right. You also have support groups, which would have been very hard to create in the real world, so-called real world. Right. Because think about it, if you want to create a group to advocate for LGBT rights, it's very easy to create a Facebook group. You can do it right now if you want to. And you don't have any legal there are no legal barriers to doing it, except of course that you could be censored. But that is a risk that you might want to take. But to create an actual NGO in the physical world requires you to register that NGO. And in countries where it's still a crime to be gay, for example, in Pakistan, it is still a crime to be homosexual. You cannot create a registered NGO to protect LGBT rights. But you can create a Facebook group, unless of course the government censors you. So there is some sense of freedom and yet a sense of fear and censorship that comes in with the internet. And that is an important aspect of what it means to have an alternative sexuality in India. Those of you who do not possess an alternative sexuality might be confused that how could the internet be so complicated? It's already very complicated for men and women. Imagine how complicated it is for men and women who are supposedly different. So that is a little bit about the digital realm. Um, I don't really want to go very much in detail about other institutions because I understand in the course of this certificate program, you have other people who will be talking to you about other institutions. But what I basically mean by other institutions is that we live in a world where our lives are governed by by many actors, by many organizations, by many people, and those actors typically come together and coalesce and form what in many in the social sciences it's known as an institution, a social institution. So the family is a social institution, healthcare, the education sector, religion, all of these institutions govern our lives. And so in contemporary India you will see that the popularity or the significance of people with alternative sexualities has actually been picking up over the past couple of years. I've shown you a photo of Kolkata Pride because I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pride parades. Pride parades happen once a year and is an opportunity for queer people to meet and to basically walk in solidarity with each other. And you can see the rainbow colored um, cloth that they're carrying. That is the pride flag, which is rainbow colored. You can even see a very nice picture of a man with a umbrella, which is rainbow colored. So the pride parade happens once a year, and it is that one time in the year where you can actually be yourself. You can see one man is wearing a mask. He doesn't want to be seen because, as you can see, this is a lecture and which we are broadcasting these photos. So he clearly doesn't want the world to know who he is. But the person next to him is confident. He wants the world, he's okay with the world knowing who he is. So pride is one aspect where you see people have the opportunity to be themselves. So this is one physical one institution, the social institution, which is a social movement where people from the queer community are able to actually be themselves and be out and proud and kind of showcase who they are. You have NGOs, as I told you about, in the physical space who organize events and advocacy sessions and awareness camps. So the Humsafar Trust is one such organization. It was established in '94, I understand, by Ashok Rao Kavi. And over the past couple of years, there have been many more such NGOs in India. Many of you who are interested in LGBT rights can actually consider doing an internship or might want to work with them. Or for those of you who understand are PhD students or master students, you could even consider connecting with them for research work because these organizations are very interested, more often than not, interested in LGBTQ advocacy and research. So students like yourself would be a very good audience for them. We also see the media, especially Bollywood, catching up. This was a Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga is a Bollywood movie. It talks about I don't want to give spoilers, but it basically has an LGBTQ angle. It has a same sex relationship in this movie. It was released in 2019, and I understand that Sonam Kapoor and her father Anil Kapoor acted together after many years. So it was a very seminal movie in that sense. The reviews were actually very average. Um, Interestingly, the reviews were average because of the performance of the actors, not so much because of the actual script, which I was very interesting to know because I actually looked at the reviews, I read the reviews, and I wanted to see why has this movie done so badly in the box office. It was actually not the script. In fact, the script was praised. So clearly, Bollywood has now started to openly talk about these issues, but this was not always the case. And on the right hand side, you have these parties. You have this party. Kitty Sue is it's a nightclub in Delhi that is run by a gay man, and run by a gay man. And you have these people who are trans. Some of them are trans. Some of them are gay men who cross dress and perform. But mind you, this is very limited to the urban space in cities. You don't see this kind of events happening in the villages or in small towns or peri-urban areas. So clearly, there is a lot of work to be done because the pride parades, all of these things typically happen in metro cities. Bollywood is a very interesting example of how you can reach out to the masses, but even there, a lot of work needs to be done. And at this point, I have, as you can see, I've put some question marks here for maybe some of you to think about. Feel free to engage with me in the Q&A because there is a lot of work to be done because our education system, do we talk about LGBTQ rights? At least we are talking about it today in this certificate course. But how many people in our country attend such certificate courses? How many people in this country are even interested in these issues? If you talk about healthcare also, as I told you before, for a very long time, the community has been stigmatized. People said that you were mentally ill if you were transgender or if you were gay. And not only that, people who have HIV/AIDS are a disproportionate number of them are actually what we call in medical terms MSM, men who have sex with men. And so the healthcare system has ignored them also. So there's an HIV aspect as well. I don't know if I need to go much into religion. I think most of you will know that in most religious texts, there is some sort of not texts rather, but most there are lots of people who hold very strongly held religious views against this entire discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity. So you typically see that religious opposition is always a problem. Um, I talk about the informal economy also because the informal economy is one sector of our political economy that we typically don't talk about in relation to sexual rights and gender rights. We typically assume that LGBT activism should be restricted to the corporates, to these big fancy MNCs. But the question that we should all ask is that doesn't everybody in the country deserve to have LGBTQ rights recognized? It could be the case that people in the informal economy, most of them happen to be from marginalized sections, should also have the same recognition if they happen to be queer. Right. So a good way of thinking about it is that imagine if tomorrow you go out there and you work for a company like Accenture or Godrej, and you are a gay person. Your company will actually give you a very good policies and protections because of your orientation, because in Accenture and Godrej and in, I believe, Tata, they recognize LGBTQ community. They have a LGBTQ resource center as well. But think about the informal sector, people who are working as your street vendors. Think about people who are coming and cleaning your home, your domestic help. They form what is called the informal economy. Would you as an employer, if in case you employ somebody in from the informal economy to work for you, would you treat them differently if you found out that they are transgender or gay or lesbian? Right, what if you found out that the person who gives you who sells vegetables to you is actually having a illicit affair or is a homosexual man? Will that change the way you look at them? Because we tend to think of homosexuality and transgender rights and all of these things as very elite, as very elite identities. But of course, you have certain people from the LGBT community, like the Hijra community, Kothi community, that challenge that, who say that I can be low, I can belong to a marginalized section, I can belong to a section that you may not expect me to belong from, and still assert my identity. So the informal economy is the economy where most people in India work, and we need to talk about how LGBTQ issues are not talked about enough in this section of the economy. The family is very evident. My research delves into that, so I will talk about that later. I've already spoken about the government because the government and the law are very intertwined. The police, I will just say this, that for a long time, Section 377 was used by police officers to harass people who were gay. So even today, there's a very lack of police sensitization, and that is a problem. And of course, mainstream media it's very important for these issues to be recognized in the media, the mainstream media. So Bollywood, for example, is one great way of mainstreaming an alternative sexuality. And notice how I've juxtaposed the two words, mainstream media and alternative sexuality. But we need more of that. So your NDTV, for example, I know has regular discussions on same-sex marriage. I think Times Now also has had people on the show. Republic, I remember, had a Shokraw Kavi, the founder of Humsafar Trust, on 3-4 years back. So there is some discussion, but then again, it's limited to a few media segments. You need to see more conversations, and even people who are openly queer, so many of them are too afraid to come out. So there is a lot of work to be done. And I think when we talk about other institutions, Professor R. Rao, who I'm not sure if they will be speaking to you during the course of the certificate program, but I think many of you would have heard about him. In fact, Professor and I were talking about his book Criminal Love just yesterday on the phone. He's written about this, and very poignantly, he talks about how these other institutions that I refer to have suppressed queer people. Um, he specifically talks about three institutions: religion, law, and medicine. I've highlighted it here. So I'm just going to go again, pause for a few minutes. I think it'll be great for all of you to just read this. We'll then continue the discussion after you've done reading this. Oops, sorry. Oh, my apologies. Should I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I mean, there are many social institutions that have in the past negatively criminalized or basically shown discredit towards the queer community. We briefly spoke about them. Um, and what's very fascinating is that there seems to be it seems to have been that there was a consensus between religious institutions and religious leaders, legal practitioners, and doctors and psychiatrists that homosexuality was wrong, being transgender was wrong, and this was the norm for a very long period of time, not just in India, but in many parts of the world. I believe it was in the 1940s that there was a study done. It was called the Kinsey Studies, which was a landmark study. It was done in the US, which basically consisted of a set of surveys. And this individual, I believe his name was Mr. Saunders, Professor Saunders. He basically, what he did was he interviewed people who identified as lesbian and people who identified as gay, and also people who were not sure of their sexuality. And he came up with this very radical idea that sexual orientation was not something it was not a binary. So at that time in the 1940s, it was considered that sexual orientation was a binary. either you're homosexual or you're heterosexual. He actually said that there is a 6 point scale, and that sexual orientation is a spectrum. And so, depending on how much or how less of attraction you have towards people who are of the same sex or of a different sex, you fall on that spectrum. And his research found that most people in his sample, which was a very large sample, was somewhere in the middle. So, in other words, according to him, almost there are what he basically was trying to say that a lot of people in his study would identify as what you would call today as bisexual. And what he also said was that because a large number of people in his sample size fell in the middle, that would mean that to call such people as sexual minority is wrong, because they are actually the majority. So he asked people questions like, have you ever had a sexual encounter with a woman? He asked women this question. He asked men the same question. Have you ever had sexual encounters with a man? If you have, how many times have you had it? And he found that a lot of people in their lifetime have had some sort of sexual encounter with somebody of the same sex. And so and of course, based on how often and how frequent they had sex with somebody or had intercourse or attraction with somebody of the same sex, he plotted their orientation on that chart, and he created that 6 point scale. So that was a very landmark study. Now, it was done in the 1940s, and it was criticized also because of the methodology, and also because of the fact that it was done in a certain context. If you were to do a similar study in India, you might find different results because people here may not be comfortable talking about their sexual orientation. So it's very hard to say if the survey results were even valid. But what he basically was trying to tell us is that sexual orientation is very complex. It's something that may lie on a spectrum. It is something that you cannot really identify as straight, gay, woman, man, lesbian, bisexual, whatever. It is very complex, and that goes back to that entire discussion of the rainbow, or rather the umbrella, which you can think of as a rainbow. And it was very interesting that we saw that picture of a person holding a rainbow colored umbrella. So I think that is if there's anything that you remember from this lecture, is just remember that umbrella that looks like a rainbow, which is also the colors that this book holds. That is really a good way of understanding alternative sexualities. And all of this in spite of religion saying that sexuality, the ultimate aim of sexuality is procreation. For some religions, marriage is between a man and a woman, and the ultimate goal is to raise a child. So if you're a homosexual person or a transgender person, you're incapable of producing a child. You're incapable of loving or even marrying somebody who is of the opposite sex. And so it becomes a problem for religion when somebody says they're homosexual. And so automatically the knee-jerk reaction is that this is a sin or this is against our culture. It's with the law also, right? The law has traditionally not been able to understand desire. So there's no need to, I mean, Madhavi Menon has spoken about this already. We just discussed it a while ago, and our Professor Rao seems to be agreeing with what she's saying. And as far as medicine is concerned, I think when you speak to the medical practitioners in the next couple of weeks and days, this is something that you could even talk to them and ask them, which is how has the medical practice and psychology, the psychiatric field, how has it changed? Because as I said at the beginning of my lecture, that the Indian Psychiatric Association recently said that homosexuality is natural and normal, but they did not say this many years ago. So why has it taken the medical community so long? And even today, I can guarantee you that if some of you tell your parents that you are gay or lesbian, they might tell you that, okay, let's go to a doctor for an opinion. Some doctors who are, I would say, educated enough to know their field will tell you that there's nothing wrong with you. But there will be some doctors who will say, oh, don't worry, I have a cure. Have this Ayurvedic medicine, have this medicine. This will help you. It will make you normal, so-called normal. So even within the medical community, at least in India, there is still a long way to go. And maybe one solution is a legislation that bans conversion therapy or bans any form of anti-queer practice. And in many Western countries, this is something that has been tabled. In Canada, I believe the Canadian courts recently what was the word? They banned conversion therapy. But in India, we don't have such a law. So there is clearly a lot of work that needs to be done. We have a little bit of time, so I will just, I think this is something that might interest some of you, because what I've been talking so far has been very, very theoretical. But when I was in my university, I did an independent study that tried to bring together all of these concepts. And I'd be very happy to answer some of your questions, because I did this study by actually interviewing people with alternative sexualities. And they said some very fascinating things to me that even I think that queer theory has not been able to answer as of yet, because when I analyzed some of the answers they gave me, it surprised me. Basically, if you can, as you can see at the top, my study was basically trying to understand how sexual minorities addressed the challenges in their homes when it came to the pressure of entering into marriages. And as I said right at the beginning of my lecture, most of you, I'm sure some of you, I don't know how many of you are married or not, but marriage is something that seems to be almost universal in Indian culture, right? Your parents expect you to get married and have a child. And so, what do you do if you're a gay person? What do you do if you're a lesbian person? Because you have to then make a choice that I marry somebody or I don't. But then how do I interact with my parents and my cousins and my mama, mami, chacha, chachi? How do I tell them that I cannot marry? So I wanted to understand how do sexual minorities figure out and navigate this very complicated landscape, which is not really meant for them, right? Because marriage as an institution should ideally be for everyone, but that's not the way it is today in India. So that was my research objective. I asked very specific questions to my research participants. I wanted to understand how not only did they interface with this institution, but also how did their identity belonging to a certain religious community, a caste community, a class community impact this decision. Because as we all know, that it is not just your sexual orientation or gender identity that determines how you interface with the world. Your position as a Dalit, as a tribal person, as a Brahmin, as a Hindu, Muslim, also shapes the way in which you interact with marriage. Because as we all know, marriage is to a very large extent determined by your caste background and your class background, your religious background, your socioeconomic status. So these things matter, and these are the things I wanted to ask my participants. I basically, what I did was, this was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I had to reach out to people, and I was able to connect with a large set of people from different ages, people from very different parts of the country, and I basically had conversations with them. It's called qualitative research, and this was done over a period of 3 to 4 months. And it was a very interesting set of conversations I had, because I spoke to people whose gender identities and sexual orientations were so diverse. In fact, even I didn't realize that you could have so many people identifying so many different ways. So just for the sake of transparency, I wanted to share with you the just a brief of who these people were. Of course, as you can see, their names are not real, because many of them did not want to be identified, and those names that you do see are not their real names. They are just pseudonyms. So I interviewed 16 people, but I interviewed many of them twice, and I spoke to them for close to 2 hours. And you can see that they've come from various parts of the country. And when I asked them about their orientation, you can see some people said they were lesbian, some said they were gay, some said they were bisexual. So it's very, very diverse. The age is also very, very diverse. I will keep this slide on for a few minutes, but just if direct your attention, look at serial number 10 and look at serial number 1. You will see the difference in age, and that was the richness, something that I found very fascinating, that you could interview people who are so young and so old and get very, very similar answers also. So just wait for a few minutes so you can read this, and then we'll proceed. So they were all Indian participants. And as you can see in the sexual orientation section, you may see some words like homoromantic, asexual, bisexual slash lesbian. Why have I used bisexual slash lesbian? What does that mean? Why have I used the word queer? So if you want, you could maybe put down these questions, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. There is a bit of time. Yeah, I think we have around 10 minutes. So yeah, just in a snapshot, 26 interviews, and 16 of which were unique, as in there were 16 people I spoke to. I've basically just kind of encapsulated everything. The median age was 30, and these are the states that I covered, including there were 2 people who were abroad at the time of the study. So very, very diverse group of people, but the sample size was small. Again, that was also because the I had very less time to do the research, given that it was in my college, but it was still very interesting. Um, I will not go into too many details because of time, but what I found in my research, from these interviews, was that it is very hard to categorize people in boxes and to say that all queer people face the same problems. If you remember the entire point of doing this research study, and I'm just going to open that slide once again. If you look at the research objective, the whole point of doing this study was to understand how sexual minorities in India negotiate with the different kinds of pressures associated with entering into family driven heterosexual marriages in India, which basically means that how do you deal with marriage pressure in very simple English. And these pressures can be social, cultural, religious, economic, political, psychological, emotional, or otherwise, because marriage is something that has a political dimension, a cultural dimension, a religious dimension, an economic dimension. It's absolutely multifarious. And so I found there were many research findings. What I will just probably stick to would be it's just the key highlights. So one of the things I found very interesting was that I found that some of the people who identified as Brahmin told me that even though they identified as Brahmin, that they were not more comfortable or less comfortable than some of the other participants who belong to what we would call the marginalized castes, simply because their parents were very orthodox. So I found that very interesting. What I also found very interesting in terms of when we talk about religion is that you had a few people, Noor and SM. These are two of my research participants who also told me that in their religious, they belong to the Said sect in Islam, who said that their parents were very, very orthodox as well. So I found that it's whether you are a Brahmin, whether you are not a Brahmin, whether you are a Said Muslim, and I'm sure if you talk to people from other religious communities as well, Sikhs, Christians, etc., you will see that the role of that parents have in terms of socializing their children about sexual orientation and gender identity is actually quite similar, but the language that is used is different. The language is the language of it being a sin, it being against our culture. So for example, the Muslim participants said that our parents said it was a sin, but the Brahmin participants, they said that it was not they did not use the word sin, but they said that it is against our family values. And so I found that very interesting. And so it was very, very fascinating to see that the religious hierarchies in Hinduism and Islam were evident, and also that there seemed to be a lot of orthodoxy across caste lines in Hinduism and in Islam. The two Islam Muslim participants did tell me and acknowledge that there was a correlation between the religion that their parents practiced and their idea of sexuality. When it came to mental health, what I found was that I went into the field thinking that because of this marriage pressure, a lot of these people might suffer from depression and trauma, but that was not the case. Two of my participants actually told me that even though they were pressurized to marry, they were not suffering from depression. And that was very, very fascinating. They told me that if you have personal strength and confidence, then you will be able to escape the marriage pressure. And that really shows you the resilience that queer people have. When I talked about, if at the beginning I told you to look at the profiles of two people, number 10 and number 1, both of them had a very similar story to share about the way their parents perceive their sexual orientation. Manish is 72 years old, and S is 21 years old, but both of their parents do not support them and do not acknowledge the fact that they happen to be gay or lesbian, despite the fact that they are both born in different eras. But that being said, a lot of my younger participants did say that thanks to a lot of pride events and a lot of advocacy and thanks to the internet, that things have become easier for them. And of course, when we talk about gender, I'll just very briefly say that I did not find that women, I used to think that men had it easier than women, but apparently the women in my sample, in my research, said that they feel that gay men and lesbian women are just as oppressed because when it comes to marriage pressure, women, of course, are expected to behave a certain way, but they said that men also have a lot of pressure on them. And lastly, when it came to same-sex marriage, I asked them a question. I asked them what they think about same-sex marriage. All of them supported same-sex marriage, but they also said that they were very concerned that whether it would be tenable, given that some of my gay participants said that they feel that gay men are not monogamous, and they also felt that unless society changes its thinking, it will not matter because people will still discriminate against you. So that was a very, I would say, very realistic and very interesting perspective on an issue that a lot of us are talking about today. So I'll just sum up because it's almost, I think it's 3:43. I'll just sum up, and I'll just leave you with some questions. I mean, I'll probably leave this slide on. But what I want you to think about is, I've talked to you about alternative sexuality in contemporary India. I've talked to you about queer theory. I've talked to you about media, about the law, about policy, about some of my research work, and what some people have told me. And please feel free to ask me more questions in the Q&A. But it still leaves a lot unresolved, right? And because when I mentioned the Kinsey studies, I told you that maybe it's a myth to say that people with alternative sexualities are a minority. And also, why should we call them alternative, right? Why is it that a gay person is alternative but a straight person is not? Because now we know that it's not abnormal, we know it's not unnatural, we know it's not a sin. So why do we still use this language, and for how long should we use this language? And of course, when we talk about sexual orientation and identity, which is so fluid, the internet has played a big role in this, and it has made our understanding of our orientation more complicated. So as I said before, you have the government of India which passes certain laws, but on the internet you can do something completely different, right? It may be a crime to be gay in India, but on Facebook you're sitting in your own home in India, and you are maybe trying to flirt with another man or another woman. And so it's fascinating when I think about it, that you have a politics of status legislation, or very nation state centered legislation, but on the internet you can do whatever you want, of course limited to censorship because it's international. The boundaries are limitless. And so for a queer person, it opens a lot of doors and also shuts a lot of doors because of bullying, harassment, and censorship. So the internet is a very complicated place. And so we've discussed some of this, we've discussed some of the other institutions. I would like to I find this very fascinating. In point number 4, I've used the word criminalized, sinned, and pathologized, because law, religion, and medicine form this kind of a, I don't know, like a trinity, where you can imagine a gay person in the middle, and you have the law, medicine, and religion all trying to suffocate the person. And that is what it has been like for queer people. But there is always hope. And I think maybe some of the questions that you will ask might be questions about what the future looks like, because things have progressed and changed. And my research study shows that even though people in India, sexual minorities, have very diverse backgrounds, they seem to have very similar views on certain issues. And I think with same-sex marriage, it's very evident that all my participants believed that same-sex marriage should be legal, but they also had apprehensions about it. And I think in the classroom also we can maybe talk about same-sex marriage as well, because it's being debated as we speak in the Delhi High Court. So there's a lot to discuss. I hope I didn't confuse you, and I tried my best to make sure that I was able to relate to those of you who are young and just starting off and understanding sexual orientation and gender identity politics, and some of you who are doing masters and PhD. So in case anything was unclear, I'd be happy to answer them. So that's about it. I am on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I will be happy to connect. And any other questions, please feel free to ask. Over to you, Professor. I'm done with my presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kanav. It was really very enlightening and very specific. I would say very specific. And there were some of the points wherein you have covered, which already these things, these terms, these cis, when you were talking about normative, right? So these are the terms that has been used, and our participants are aware about these terms because Dr. Professor Raj Rao, in the last week, he talked about all these terms. So thank you once again. And now the session is open for questions, and I will give it to over to you, Shivani ma'am, and please proceed further. Thank you.
Uh, so how so how do we go about this? Should I read out the questions, or can you access the chat?
I can actually access the chat,
All
but maybe you could select the questions. That will be great because they're in different orders, and I'll be happy to just answer them one by
all
one.
right. So I'll just start with the first one. Is there a consensus in the queer community concerning same-sex marriage?
Right. If just give me a minute, please. I'm just going to charge my laptop. I can see the battery's a bit low. Just give me a second, please. Right, thank you. So the answer is that there is no consensus at the moment. Very, very briefly, the book that I recommended, Madhavi Menon's book, if you go to the last chapter of that book, she talks about same-sex marriage. So some within the queer community, there are one group of people that believes that legalizing same-sex marriage is the low-hanging fruit. It is the next best thing that the queer community can do because we've decriminalized homosexuality, and so, if it's not a crime to be gay, why is it that only straight people can marry? Why can't gay people also marry? So, that is one argument that a lot of people are saying. Plus, in our country, you have the Special Marriage Act. So, even if people who have religious opposition to same-sex marriage are there, which they are, there is a legal argument to be made that you have a Special Marriage Act which can probably be amended to include gender neutral terms. So that is actually a possibility in our country. In many countries like in America and in Canada and in the US, sorry, America, UK, Canada, where there is one common marriage law, there was and still is fierce opposition towards the legalization of same sex marriage. That's not the case in India. That being said, the counter argument is that why is marriage the focus of the queer community? The queer community is supposed to stand for that which is not normative. Why is it that they want to copy what heterosexual people are doing? There is a term which I'm going to put in the chat box called homonormativity, which Professor Rao talks about in his book, which basically means why are the homosexuals trying to copy the heterosexuals? Why do they want to live almost an identical life to heterosexuals? And that is something to think about. Queer is supposed to mean that which destabilizes normativity. So there are different perspectives. I'll just leave it at that because we have other questions. I think people are raising their hands also. So yeah.
Yes. So actually, this is a question from me. I have definitely seen, or rather, all of us have seen a huge rise in movies showcasing a lot of issues revolving the community, right? But there are two points to that aspect also. There's a point which says that the Bollywood is using this to capitalize on it, while some say that it acts as a tool of awareness. So I'm talking especially with reference to recent movies like Badhai Do and Chandigarh Kare Ashki. So I wanted to know your views about that. Like, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I actually saw Chandigarh Kare Ashiki a few weeks ago, and I've heard about Badai, who it talks about lavender marriages. It's similar, I would say my views are similar to the views I raised about homo capitalism and pinkwashing. That, you know, Bollywood, there was a time when there was a Bollywood movie called, I don't know if it was Bollywood, it was a movie called Fire. It was directed by Deepa Mehta. I'll just put it in the chat box so people can maybe Google it later. It was a movie about same-sex love. It was released, I believe, in the 1990s. It was met with severe criticism and protests, vandalism, and thereafter Bollywood kind of became silent. Now that 377 is gone, now that the Nalsa judgment has come in, you're seeing all these movies created, and now I think Bollywood actors want to they stand, it's as though they're standing in a line to play these queer actors, uh, and so I am a bit suspicious because the question I have is where were you in 2001? There were a few movies like My Brother Nikhil and Dostana that were released, but again Dostana received a lot of criticism. Some people said it stereotyped the gay community. It was not very sensitive, I would say. My Brother Nikhil was definitely a bit more bold, but the question is, why now? After the judgment is made, when it's now now it's the next big thing. Why now? So I don't know, I think it's a complicated issue. I am suspicious, but at the same time you're very right that it leads to greater awareness, money, it reaches out to the masses. So there is a positive side to it also. So for me, it's not a good or bad, there's a gray area to it.
Actually, Rajiv has pointed out a very pertinent issue when it comes to Bollywood, that the actors that play these characters are generally cishet. And this is a trend that we see mostly in India or in Bollywood. The Hollywood has been a little more accepting when it comes to, I think, I don't know if you've seen the series called Orange is the New Black. There was a transgender actor and a character who played the same role. So I haven't seen that in Bollywood as of yet, other than the one characters which are used in a funny way for comic effect. That I personally don't agree to. But yes, Rajiv has a very pertinent point that generally these characters are played by cishet actors.
Yeah. And it's not just with queer communities. How many Dalit actors play Dalit roles? How many movies about Dalit lives are clearly, very explicitly mentioned in a very sensitive way? The same with tribal communities, Adivasi communities. I mean, it just goes on and on. I think, to my knowledge, there is also criticism of how religious minorities are also portrayed. There is a lot going on. I think it's important to just have good representation. People who are producers, the directors, the screenwriters, they should belong to the community that the movie espouses to talk about. I think that is important. So it's about different identities also.
Right. I will just read out the next question. Is the Indian film industry really serious about same sex marriages? We don't find serious representation of same sex marriages. If the sentiment of the mass, that is generally considered to be heteronormative, is only considered as the important factor for box office, then where lies the serious engagement of queer activism in making same sex marriages a regular cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to understand in this question is, why is Bollywood is not talking about same sex marriage enough? Like, why are there not enough movies about it? Because most people in the audience will be typically cisgender people, heterosexual people who are not probably not even aware about this idea of same sex marriage. And I think that's again goes back to the first point that you had raised about how Bollywood is now talking about LGBTQ issues through movies like Badai Ho, which I think talks about lavender marriages. There was that movie Shubh Mangal Savdhan, I can't remember the full name, which I think was about, I had featured Ayushman Khurrana. And so you have these conversations are starting, but you're absolutely right that why is Bollywood not talking about it enough? I would say not just Bollywood. My grandmother watches a lot of these TV serials, Saas Bahu serials. I don't think any of them actually feature gay people or queer people in a positive light. I have actually watched some of it with her. It is something I have not seen, and I know that those TV serials actually reach out to a large audience as well. It's not just Bollywood, and it reaches out to a particular type of audience. So you'll see on Netflix, you have a certain type of young millennial audience where you see this happening. You see depiction. You have TV shows like Four Shots Please, where I think Bani, I can't remember her name, Bani J, she plays a bisexual character. But then you go and you see what your grandmother is watching or your mom is watching, and you will see it's as if they don't exist. So there is a lot of issues, and I think we have to look beyond Bollywood, look at also your Tollywood, look at your Collywood and various other uh, industries, and you'll see that there is a big gap that should be addressed.
Right. We have a question from Sarvesh. He asks, we definitely agree that queerness or being queer is not an urban phenomenon. What should be done so that more queer individuals who live in remote areas come out of their closets?
Yeah, that's a very good question because there's this scholar whose name is Ashley Tellis. Let me just put it down in the chat box so you can maybe Google his work later. Sorry, it's Ashley. So he's a queer theorist. He studied at Cambridge and he actually writes about this. If you remember in my presentation, I use the word LGBT movement in quotation marks. because Ashley Tellis tells us that he believes that there is no such thing as one LGBT movement. He says it's a very, very elitist movement, which you see is limited to cities and urban areas. It's very unfortunate, but a lot of NGOs, I think that even the NGOs that do work on gender rights in the rural areas, they do not talk about sexuality. Even Professor Rao has written about this in his book Criminal Love, where he says that most NGOs, when they talk about gender, they talk about women, as if men don't have a gender, and as if lesbian women don't even exist, as if gay men don't even exist. So if you actually see a lot of these NGOs that talk about, that focus on rural development and all sorts of things, if you look at government programs that focus on rural issues, you'll see that LGBT issues are absent. And so I think the only solution is that grassroots activism is needed. So people like you, people like me who are interested in these issues should try to reach out to people in rural communities and help set up clinics, or do some sort of sensitization program and reach out to people in rural areas, because they exist there. And I cannot imagine how tough it must be and suffocating it must be to live in an environment where you cannot even express yourself. And just one last point I'll make is that when I was in my university, I actually went to a village in Kerala where I asked the principal of a very big school there about whether there were any queer people, and he said that हमारे जगह में ये सब नहीं रहते, ये cities में रहते हैं, which means that, for those who don't understand Hindi, that he's just saying that we these kinds of people don't exist here, they exist in the cities. When I went back and I spoke to the coordinator of my of this internship program I was a part of, she told me that this is unfortunately a trend that a lot of people in rural areas, they migrate to cities precisely because they don't want to stay in that very homophobic environment. So it's very sad. Why do you have to move to another place when you should be comfortable in your own environment? And there is a lot of work to be done. I think the queer movement in general has failed to reach the grassroots, and that is unfortunate.
We have a question from Saloni. She asks, what do you understand by the term homoromantic asexual?
Yeah, so I also didn't understand this when that research participant told me. So basically, how it works is that it'll be a bit it's a little complex. So basically, how it works is that the word sexual orientation that we use, there are some people who will say that it's wrong to use that word, because if you think about it, the word sexual orientation has the word sex to it. But why is it that that word has to be attached to somebody who you're romantically attracted to? So there are some people who do not have sexual interests in somebody of the same sex, but might have romantic interests in them. So it's a very interesting, this is a person, he's a homoromantic asexual. He tells me that he is not attracted, he does not want to have sex, hence he's asexual. So he does not like to engage in what you call penetrative sex, but he wants romance, and he wants romance with the same person. So he's homoromantic asexual. So imagine if you're a woman who loves another woman but does not want to have penetrative sex or any form of vaginal sex with that woman. You are a homoromantic asexual woman. That's what it is. It's a bit complicated, but this is actually this is again why that acronym is so long. You have that plus plus plus. It's because of these terminologies. I don't know if I was able to explain it, but I tried my best.
Uh, Shubham, you wish to unmute yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, thank you for your very engaging session. My question is that I had the opportunity to kind of making an academic paper on this queer networking sites, and I worked on Grindr and this Blue and Planet Romeo. So what I just found that those the queer activists who rather talk about these against body shaming, against this kind of gender binaries, and about this very fixity of the gender roles and about the sexual roles. Uh, when they kind of have a profile on Grindr or this Blue or the Planet Romeo on the dating sites or the dating apps, we find that what they actually want or what they actually kind of write as their preferences, that actually subscribing to again those gender norms and about this fixing of roles like this body shaming using the words like no sissy, no uncles, no fatty, and so all these things are there. And the kind of conversation that start with is that top, bottom, that kind of binary. So, I mean, why is this kind of contradiction? I mean, that appears to be a very interesting phenomenon that you claim to be activist on the open social networking sites and what you actually kind of offer as your preferences on the gay queer dating apps.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. It's I think it's an example of some sort of hypocrisy maybe. Um, I don't know. I mean, it just shows that I personally believe that one should practice what they preach. So if somebody is talking about equality and justice, then that is how you should try to. That's the kind of life that you should live, and it is not easy. I think a lot of us, because we are so socially conditioned to treat people differently, which is no excuse for body shaming somebody. I think many activists sometimes feel that, oh, I can get away with it because people can attend my lecture where I talk about all these things, but when I'm on a dating app, I don't know if those same people will recognize me. I can hide behind a mask. And I think that goes back to the discussion I was having about the internet, that it gives you anonymity, which can be misused also. You can use it to hide your true identity. So it is again, I think it makes me think about how the internet can be misused. It also reminds me that it's very important for us to practice what we preach, and also to be honest and transparent, that it's that, if you believe that certain bodies are better than other bodies, like there are some people who believe that, if you're fat, then that means that you're lazy, and and there are people I know in my personal life who will not change their mind. Be honest and transparent and make an argument, if you're an academic, about why you think that is the case. Even though I personally do not support body shaming, there are some people who will believe in it. So I think just be honest, be transparent. And why people behave this way, Shubham, I don't know why people do that. Maybe they are just doing it because they know they will not be caught until they are, such as I think your research has probably found that out.
Yeah, I'll just a one rejoinder I'd like to make, that it appears to me that when you actually kind of talking about within a queer space, then this whole sort of queerness is also being appropriated by the masculinity, and this whole heteronormativity that is also appropriating the even the very exclusive queer space. That is what I think about.
Yeah. Rohit Dasgupta has written about this also, and he talks very very eloquently about how there's a certain type of body that is considered appealing. You'll see feminine queer men, for example, on gay dating apps are made fun of and body shamed. Even Professor Rao has written about this. So he actually, there's a book which I will just put down here. It's called Queer Sex Love. Professor Rao writes about this book in his he writes about this book in his own book. About it's a very interesting account of a man who engages in penetrative anal sex and yet identifies as a masculine man who wants to raise a family and actually gives birth to children and raises a child with another woman. And it's very interesting because he challenges our notions of masculinity and heteronormativity. And this is a book that I now want to read because of what Professor Rao has written in his own book. So I think, to your point about appropriation, unfortunately, a lot of these spaces are appropriated, but then you have very interesting accounts that challenge that. And that's also something to think about. You're welcome, Shubham.
Yeah,
I
thank you
had
so
a question. So, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you spoke about the same sex marriage as the next logical step for the queer community. And we are speaking, so generally, people tend to speak more about the gender neutral notions and having gender neutral laws for marriage. Always of the opinion that incorporating gender is quite essential because gender neutral laws we had it earlier, and then we brought special laws for different genders. But do you think that gender neutrality, because it might be my requirement of having a contrary view so that I can work more on my views. Do you think that gender neutrality can only be a solution, or is there a certain essentialism that we generally see when we speak about all these laws?
Yeah, I think this essentialism versus, so actually Professor Rao also, I'm sorry for keep continuously citing him. He talks about this difference between an essentialist view and a constructivist view. So, I personally feel that it is again, it is a very, very complex, because there is a certain essentialist aspect also to, for example, rape and sexual violence that women experience. Um, uh, it is probably essential to, in a country like India, to have a separate washroom for men and a separate washroom for women, given that I don't know how many women would be comfortable with just having a gender neutral washroom in India. I've had this discussion with some of my female classmates in my university, who basically said that while they support the idea of moving into a gender neutral kind of world, is that appropriate right away, given that there's so much of gender violence in India? So maybe having some sort of sex segregation might work. It's a very controversial issue. But then there are others who will say that why should we segregate and create laws based on only gender? Because if you look at rape, man can rape another man, a woman. There is actually some research on lesbian on domestic violence within lesbian couples in the context of course, United Kingdom, the US, and Australia. And this is something that apparently the lesbian community in these Western countries do not also talk about, which is the high rate of domestic violence within their own intimate relationships. So rape can be woman on woman also. And so maybe it is important to have some sort of gender neutral laws. Personally, if you ask me, it is an issue that I am also still grappling with, because I do understand certain essentialist aspects of gender. That being said, when it comes to things like marriage, I think that marriage is probably one institution where not having where maybe expanding the scope of marriage to consenting adults might be perhaps the right step, because when you open it to consenting adults, you also open it to trans people, gender non-binary people. Maybe when it comes to things like bathroom access, or maybe hostels, you do have some unisex hostels, you have some female only hostels. There may be certain contexts where a woman's only hostel might be a good idea, or a boys only hostel might be a good idea. The question, of course, rises: what do you do with people who identifies neither male or female? There is a safety aspect, of course, to having a woman's only hostel, but then, of course, there's an exclusionary aspect. That's why this concept of gender is so complicated. And even today, I'm learning so much about gender and sexuality that I still sometimes struggle with certain issues. And that's also why these are open debates. We will keep having them, and I think we need to just keep talking about it and try to figure out a solution, because it's not, unfortunately, not something that I will be able to answer, or even other people will be able to answer on a Zoom call. But it's good to that we're talking about it.
Hi Kanav, thank you so much for the talk. So I had a question that connects like Madhavi Menon's text to the idea of same-sex marriage. So like recently in a talk on the law and desire, they also like Professor Menon also discussed like how instead of like focusing on legalizing marriage or legality of marriage for different identities, we can focus on desire, and then which also brings up the question that why do we even need the state to give these rights to individuals? Why is state interfering in the private realm, that is we are considering as relationships among two people who might be of any different identity? So since we are talking about like law and alternative identities, do you think this is a viable solution for the queer movement within India specifically to move forward, given like the law is also so much connected to morality and religion as well?
Yeah, it's very interesting you asked that. What you could do is, maybe if you get time, you could check out Arundhati, Kaju. I'm sorry, I can't remember both of their names. The two lawyers who basically were at the forefront of the 377 battle. Um, they gave a speech in the Oxford Union where they make the case for legalizing, for attempting to legalize same-sex marriage. And their argument is, which is also very compelling, which is that in our country and in all countries around the world, marriage as an institution is governed by the laws, and all marriage has also been an institution that has excluded people. In America, interracial marriage was not allowed. Same-sex marriage was not allowed. It has not been allowed in any country. It had to be fought for. And this is the history. If you read the history of same-sex marriage, you will see that after colonialism, not after colonialism, sorry, between the 1940s, 1960s up until recently, you see countries are slowly working towards legalizing same-sex marriage, and this has happened as a result of political advocacy. So the pragmatist in me will say that the law is governed in a way in which our marital lives are controlled by the state. So maybe using the judicial process and the Indian constitution to try to change the laws and make it amenable for queer people might be the practical step, given that the constitution of India is a secular document, and the laws in our country can, and there are provisions and articles in the constitution that can be used to make the case for same sex marriage. We are not a theocratic country, so we have that advantage as well. But then, of course, what Madhavi Menon is trying to remind us is that why are we using the state and giving it so much importance? Rather, the question that we should be asking is why is it that our rights are predicated on marriage? And that also is very important, because even if I'm a gay man and I have the legal right to marry, let's say from tomorrow, what if I don't find a partner? That leaves me in a very bad position. What if I'm a straight person and I don't find a partner? I will not be able to access the same entitlements as a married person. So that, I think that argument of hers really resonated with me, which is the decoupling of marriage with rights. And that is something that maybe the queer community could think about, because this is something that even people, that even activists in America and various other countries did not really think about. They were so obsessed with marriage, 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 which happened. It was a great move, great idea. It's a great moment, I would say. But what happens to those who are not married? And yes, Kumari Ruchi has mentioned it's Arundhati Kaju and Manika Guruswamy. Their talk in the Oxford Union. You can check it out on YouTube, and maybe just compare and contrast both. You'll probably start to see differences in how they think about marriage. It's interesting.
We have a question from Shivpriya. She asks, "Sir, nowadays people use pronouns like she, his, her, them, etc. on their social media platforms. How using these pronouns are effective? Does this matter?"
I think the use of pronouns on social media was started to basically teach people that you cannot assume a person's gender just by looking at their face. I could look like this, but I may identify as a woman, or I could look like, I mean, Shubham, but I could identify as a woman, or Sukanya and identify as a man, or maybe I look like this and identify as a man. So that's the whole reason why people put pronouns, and also to stand in solidarity with people uh, whose gender identity does not match the gender assigned at birth. So that is why it's used. Is it effective? I think it shows that you support the idea that it is possible for a person to have a separate gender identity and a separate gender assigned at birth. The fact that you recognize that means that you have put your pronouns, and you respect not only not only the fact that you identify a certain way, but also the fact that other people identify in different ways. It's I think a very nice thing. Of course, there's a lot of criticism. I've seen some people make fun of those who put pronouns. They say that you're just trying to be liberal and woke, and just trying to act all cool. So I think the question is, what is your intent? And especially, I would say, for people who are heterosexual or non-queer, I would say it's a nice thing. I've seen this in my organization. People add the pronouns at the bottom in the email signature also. So as a queer person myself, I know that if I want to talk to them about some queer issue, they will understand it. So it's a nice subtle way of also saying that you're an ally without actually saying it upfront. That is the other thing. But just to end, if a person doesn't add their pronouns, doesn't mean that they're not an ally. Many people don't know about it. So it's also important, I think, within your own school, if you're a part of some group in your school, or if you are some of your working professionals, to try to bring about that change. So you can try to maybe talk to your HR to encourage people to put their pronouns.
Thank you, Kana. I'll take the last question from Tishya. She asks, "Why is it that lawmakers, especially while making important decisions, say that homosexuality is not a part of our culture when history shows us that it clearly is? Is it the lack of education or knowledge? Is it the lack of willingness to educate oneself about it first before making landmark judgments?"
Yeah, that's a great question. Madhavi Menon also talks about this in her book. There's another scholar, I'll just put her name down, Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai. Salim Kidwai recently passed away. Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai have written about same-sex marriage and desire in India, in they write about the history of it, even before colonialism. There's an argument to be made that the reason why a lot of lawmakers feel this way is because of the impact of colonialism, that the British brought with them a Victorian mentality. Let's not forget that IPC Section 377 was inserted and into our Indian Penal Code by the British. There's nothing Indian about it. It's a colonial history. So to people who say that it is a part that IPC 377 is a part of our Indian culture, they are saying that Victorian morality that was put in the 1800s is a part of Indian culture. That's ridiculous. It's not like an Indian lawmaker included it. That is a really ridiculous statement. The reason lawmakers are saying it is because right now in the West, there is a strong advocacy for LGBT rights and same-sex marriage and all of that. So probably politicians see that in the West and they feel that Indians are trying to copy those in the West. And so they feel that no, in our country we are conservative. We believe in a strong family unit of man and a woman. What's happening in Western countries is different. They believe in sexual debauchery. That's the language they use. We don't want to copy them. So there's this sense of East versus West, them versus us, which is created. I think it's like you can call it like a sort of a fake culture war that some politicians like to bring up. But there's nothing Indian about it. And as I think Shubham has right nicely put, the Same Sex Love in India is a book that they've written. You can check it out. There's a history of same sex desire in our country. Madhavi Menon has written about it. There's a colonial aspect to why politicians even today say this, and one could argue that you're speaking the colonizers' language when you say that this homosexuality is against our culture, even though you claim to be nationalist or a big upholder of Indian culture. There's an argument that you're actually speaking the colonizers' voice. So that I think could be one explanation.
All right. We're done with the questions, Kanav. I would now take this opportunity to firstly thank you for accepting our invitation. I would like to put it on record that when I try to teach any subject, I first look at what Vidhi has been doing on that subject. So it is actually a go-to for me when it comes to Vidhi. Secondly, thank you for navigating through the realms of legal and digital realm while talking about alternative sexualities. It was an absolute academic treat, to be honest. My key takeaway during this entire session was when you said that queer theory is a way of viewing the world. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, answering all the questions so patiently, and we look forward to many more such associations and lectures from your end. Thank you so much, Kanav.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to all of you present. And I am also equally happy to have had this chance to speak to all of you. And I'm not sure again how much of what I said registered, because this is a very, very complicated issue, and the topic itself is it's really tough to talk about all of this in 1 hour. But I think that I hope that it has allowed some of you to think a little bit differently, perhaps, about different sexualities. And I think it's a conversation that we need to keep having. I noticed that same-sex marriage keep coming up in the questions, which is also a very contemporary issue. So it's good to know that we are still having conversations about it, and hopefully some of these the questions that were raised, especially towards the end of the lecture, about why is it that sexual minorities are considered to be a minority in light of studies like the Kinsey study. What do we do with marriage as an institution? Should we try to fit in, or should we try to do something differently? And is the online space really the best space for queer people? These are open questions. So I think we'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Kanav.
Yeah, you're
Thank
welcome.
Thank you,
Thank you.
participants. We can disperse now.